In this lecture, we're going to look at the role of the media in politics. But first, we need to talk a little bit about the development of mass media. Media, or newspapers, were very expensive at the beginning of the 18th century. Both Hamilton and Jefferson used their positions as Secretary of the Treasury and Secretary of the State to subsidize newspapers that presented their particular partisan point of view. It wasn't until the early 1800s that mass media really began to develop. Now, there were a number of factors that led to this, and we could probably take a great deal of time to talk about how the advent of cheap newspaper rather than the rag-based paper that had been using, the improved printing technology that became about, making it possible to print hundreds of papers per hour rather than hundreds per day, the advent of the telegraph, which made it possible to transmit information very, very rapidly. And then lastly, the improving educational levels of the population met with the decreasing cost of news media so that newspapers could really reach the masses. Now, responding to this, there developed national chains like the Hearst, the Pulitzers, that sort of standardized newspapers and what they contained. Electronic media began to emerge in the 1920s. The first commercial radio station signed on, and within a decade the networks had been established. If you're interested, you can probably consult Wikipedia and look at FDR and his fireside chats. World War II was the first war that was ever exclusively covered by correspondents who were actually there reporting on the scene. Now, while television had been invented in the late 30s, early 40s, it wasn't until after World War II that it became popular and the networks were established, and the first presidential convention to be covered on television was in the early 1950s. Now, there are some newspapers that are probably more important in terms of their content. The Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, the Chicago Tribune are four that come to mind, though print media are increasingly under economic pressure. The electronic media, the advent of blogs, the advent of things like the Huffington Post, where information can be transmitted very quickly and very cheaply, have eroded the advertising base for newspapers. And recently, both the Washington Post and the New York Times have been bought by individuals whose interest in perhaps enriching themselves is a little bit greater than their interest in making sure that the newspapers present a standard point of view. News magazines like Time, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report have been useful. The only one of these now that really is serious is Time magazine. Now, there are some opinion media, opinion journals like National Review, which presents the conservative point of view, the New Republic, which is the traditional liberal point of view, Commentary, which is a neo-conservative magazine with a Jewish background, and then there are specialized publications like Modern Maturity, published by AARP. It is the largest mass circulation magazine in the United States. Of course, media has changed. Satellites, cable television, narrowcasting. Everybody understands narrowcasting is exactly the opposite of broadcasting. Broadcasting seeks to reach large, broad audiences. Narrowcasting focuses on a particular group of people, for example, the Golf Channel, or Home and Garden, or the Food Channel. And then, of course, the impact of the World Wide Web is still currently being evaluated by political scientists to figure out how important it is. What are the functions of the media? To entertain? Yes. To report, or actually make news? Yes. To serve as a means of identifying public problems, watchdogs? To help socialize new generations, to provide a forum for people, but ultimately also to make profits, because if you can't keep your head above water, you're going to go out of service. Now, there's a very excellent description of the roles of the media in your textbook on page 200 to 206. The main categories they talk about are vehicles, the means by which those in positions of power are able to communicate. Gatekeepers, the media owners and editors that decide which issues are allowed to be communicated. Spotlights, focusing on particular issues or personalities. And talent scouts, allowing unknowns to become politically known. Now, what has become interesting is the role of the media in dealing with Donald Trump. And if we had time, I could probably spend an hour or two talking about that. So what are some of the trends in mass media that we're interested in? First off, ownership has increasingly been concentrated in the hands of a smaller and smaller group of individuals or corporations. The amount of news that's actually being covered has declined. There are some interesting trends that have taken place. Pack journalism, where everybody jumps on the same topic and covers it extensively and then moves on to the next. Flacks, these are paid public relations people that work for candidates, that work for agencies, that work for government, that work for corporations, that try to shape the news the way they want it seen. And there's a certain degree of media bias which everybody assumes exists and probably does. It's just hard to identify. When you evaluate the trends that have taken place in mass media, you find first off the focus of the coverage has become very game-centered. Who's ahead, who's behind, who's winning, who's losing. Journalist-centered. The journalists tend to interview each other rather than the candidates these days, and more interpretive than documentary. Now, overall, what has been discovered is that the tone of the coverage has become increasingly negative. In the 1960s, about 75% of the coverage was considered positive. However, by 2000 on, about 60% of the coverage was negative. If you look on the Gallup website at whether people trust government, there might be a direct correlation between people's trust of government and the constant focus on who's a crook or who's doing something illegal. Sound bites, where the candidates or the government officials get to talk about something. In the 1960s, this averaged about 45 seconds. Now the average is about 9 seconds. What can you say of any consequence in about 9 seconds? Game-centered. Who's ahead, who's behind? About 80% of the process. How does the media impact upon political campaigns? Without a question, the most expensive part of any political campaign is television advertising. Managing news coverage, making sure who gets what and how. And then lastly, focusing on issues. Have you been watching the campaign debates in the Republican Party? The media can force candidates to address issues that they would prefer to ignore or embarrass them. Now, lastly, let's talk a little bit about the specialized role of the media and the president. The White House Press Corps is a very elite group of people who are given the opportunity to correspond with the president on a fairly consistent basis. And the gatekeeper of the information is the president's press secretary. Some press secretaries have been very, very public. Everybody knows who they are. Others have managed to keep a much lighter identity. How can the president use mass media? Formal speeches, as we have seen in most recent days when President Obama speaks to the UN. Holding of press conferences and then creating media events, all of which help the president focus media attention. Well, this gives us some idea of the role of the media in politics. Is it a complete idea? Probably not, but then again, it would take weeks to develop this in great detail.